It is a long, dark, cold hallway. It seems mundane, especially for a hallway that cannot physically be where the door is. The geometry of the home doesn't make sense. It is larger on the inside than it is on the outside, and this door and this hallway should not be where it is. It is impossible, and it is right in front of him. It seems to be a dead end, until he turns around, and suddenly there is a new door where there was only wall. He opens the door, and there is a longer, wider corridor. He moves slowly, room by room. His vision only goes as far as his light source. The architecture gets more elaborate. It isn't just a boring hallway anymore. But was it ever just a boring hallway? Vincent pushes ahead, moving deeper and deeper into the house, eventually passing a number of doorways leading off into alternate passageways and chambers. Armed with only his camera and a flashlight, he ventures into the darkness, though even his illumination is little help, and even less comfort. Flashlight and camera skitter across ceiling and floor in loose harmony, stabbing into small rooms, alcoves, or spaces reminiscent of closets, though no shirts hang there. Still, no matter how far Vincent proceeds down this particular passageway, his light never comes close to touching the punctuation point promised by the converging perspective lines, sliding on and on and on, spawning one space after another, a constant stream of corners and walls, all of them unreadable and perfectly smooth. He then looks back and cannot see where he came from. He frantically checks around. Is that an arch? A passage to a new area? Does he dare venture forward? Could he even find his way back if he wanted to? This intense urge, this juxtaposition, explore the terrifying darkness, or flee to safety. There is a question hanging in the air, the question all who dare to penetrate the darkness ask themselves. Why am I doing this? The explorer on the edge of the seas, looking out into the unknown. The astronaut on the launch pad. The adventurer at the door of the dungeon. Why did I leave the comfort of home and put myself in this? Suddenly, immutable silence rushes in to replace what had momentarily shattered it. Vincent froze, unsure whether or not he really just heard something growl. He sprints, guesses it twists and turns, and inexplicably finds himself back where he started. He rushes back into his living room and hugs his daughter, terrified of the darkness and what may dwell within it. In an environment that has a shifting, hostile design, Vincent is grateful just to be alive and back to safety. But Vincent is resolved to re-enter the hallways. But next time, he will have a group and weapons. That is my favorite part of the 2000 ergodic horror novel House of Leaves. It is the section in the Vincent records where Will Vincent decides to explore the mysterious door he finds in his home. He is compelled. The strangeness of it, the unknown, pulls him in like a siren song. It is the same urge that has us reaching for our phones when we see an actor who we can't quite place how we know them. It's the same urge that led our ancestors to leave Africa and explore the rest of the world. It is the same urge that led others to get on boats and venture across the sea. Some of us are drawn to these places. Most of us never go into the dark and unknown depths. Our lives are too comfortable. A nice chair, a warm meal, safety, and security. We're like Bilbo or Frodo, sitting in the Shire enjoying feasting and smoking. But that doesn't make a good adventure. Why do so many adventurers have tragic backstories? Because a happy, content person doesn't risk their lives for fortune and glory. Dungeons have been an intrinsic part of tabletop role-playing games from the beginning. The game that created the modern hobby starts with the word dungeons, even before dragons. And in fact, in the old days, you were far more likely to find a dungeon in games than you were to find any dragons. While I think dungeons have fallen out of favor in recent years and in recent editions of the game, even folks who don't consider themselves tabletop gamers have similar images come into their minds when they think of dungeons. Gray cobblestones, wooden doors with rusty iron bands across them, torches holstered along stone walls. The word's history is weird. The dungeon comes from the French word for the innermost tower in the castle, the central keep where the lord of the manor would reside. The English turned it into a word for prisons, keeping the noble prisoners in a place that would be the hardest place for them to be rescued. Originally the inner keep, but then later an underground cell. Consider the Tower of London, a notorious place where nobles and even royal prisoners were kept in a central white tower, a place of torture, imprisonment, and despair. Even in fantasy, the dungeon was a prison. Not necessarily the subterranean lair of an evil lich at this point. We get to that later. Dungeons made their way into its modern use in the early 1970s. Dave Arneson, arguably the person most responsible for pushing war games into role-playing games, grabbed the idea from the old TSR game Chainmail. There was a paragraph in a section on sieges that discussed the possibility of using sappers to dig underground mines and to go beneath the walls of the castle to breach it from below. Arneson thought to himself, if you're going to mine under a castle to breach the walls, logically, you would end up emerging in the castle's dungeons. That turned into an underground area of the castle that would be set up to defend against those invaders. Traps, a maze, and enemies waiting for you. Things are starting to look a little familiar. It's funny how these words lose their original meanings and gain new ones, often by happenstance, without any intent behind it. Weird, as we use it in the modern English, means something that is strange or unusual.
Why are you looking at me? Go away!
But that's not what the word originally meant. Initially, it was a Proto-Germanic word meaning to come to pass. Then it was destiny, the fates, those three sisters who spin the destinies of people with their threads, were referred to as the Weird Sisters. It was this use in Macbeth that eventually turned the word into what it means today, to describe those bizarre witches around the cauldron. Dungeon went from being the central tower to an underground prison, then, due to a little fantasy game from a couple of wargamers in the Midwest, a labyrinth filled with fantasy creatures to be explored by adventurers. It would have been more accurate, however, to refer to these locations in antiquity as tombs. In the 1921 short story The Nameless City, an unnamed man ventures into an unidentified area in what he refers to as both Arabia and Africa in different parts of the story. He ventures into a temple that turns out to be a tomb of some ancient civilization. Lovecraft weaves this story with his usual existential dread, and, if we're being honest, a touch of exoticism and orientalism as well. But many of the notes ring familiar for those of us who have delved into the dark in our adventures. The narrator remarks on the denizens of these depths, not human, but something appearing as crocodile or seal or something in between. And while he fears for himself in the immediate sense, the overwhelming fear he is facing is that of the past. How ancient this ruin was. Time beyond comprehension. And what power could have felled such a magnificent civilization? Then a different issue, a new reality, a different world, an abyss that crept forward, threatening to consume. That is not dead which can eternal lie, and with strange eons even death may die. The words of the in-universe poet Alhazred, who penned the Necronomicon, echoes in the dark void. A horde of things, not just ancient, but eternal, existing outside of time, and the narrator is added to the collection. One more in the macabre menagerie of the unspoken darkness, consumed by the resounding song of the unfathomable abyss. Burying the dead is one of the oldest practices of our human species. Neanderthals buried their dead. This is a practice that dates back possibly 100,000 years, according to the burial sites at Kafsa, Israel. There is evidence that Homo naledi buried their dead over 100,000 years before that, though the human site showcases it was more of a ritual. Homo sapiens would decorate burial sites. Soon after that, tens of thousands of years ago, we started putting valuables into the graves. This started small, an animal jawbone, a beloved trinket, but it soon turned into things that would have significant value even today. The ancient Egyptian tombs are the ones that are oft discussed in Western education and media. Much of this is due to Napoleon's campaigns in Egypt in the 19th century. It's funny, Napoleonic campaigns are also the reason we call a very long game of D&D with a group of characters a campaign. Score 2 points for l'étendue. Those pyramids are ancient. In fact, they were ancient back in antiquity. As the observation goes, Cleopatra is temporally closer to iPads than she was to the Great Pyramids of Giza, probably the most famous tombs in all of history. And those tombs in the Valley of Kings were robbed in ancient times. Ancient Egypt looked at ancient Egypt in the same way that we look at ancient Rome. The pyramids are the graves of kings, and in those graves were treasures that would be unimaginable to the people of that time. Tomb Raider is not just a cool name for a video game. The term existed long before pixelated akimbo firearms. The ancient people of the world knew this. Maze-like dungeons with confusing corridors and false rooms? Not an invention of some 1970s basement gamers. Rather, they were the tools of the trade in historical royal tomb construction. Large pits for explorers to fall into, and sand traps that fill the room? Absolutely found in the Valley of Kings. The ancient Chinese historian Sima Qian discussed the use of crossbow traps to fling bolts at intruders and mercury rivers to poison anyone who dared enter the tomb of the first emperor of China. He didn't just have those terracotta warriors. Now, were these embellishments designed to deter unsavory characters from going into these forbidden places? Very possibly. But how many people were literate over 2,000 years ago? Much less how many grave robbers were literate? If the historian was deterring anyone, you'd gotta ask yourself who that audience was. That doesn't even consider the more fantastical reasons why tombs are frightening. The very nature of a crypt is a place where the dead are put to rest. Facing our own mortality is a chilling concept, at least it is for me. Horror lures me in with its morbidity, a way to face my fear in a relatively safe environment. Though every culture seems to have their own myths regarding the dead. Mummies, ghouls, ghosts, revenants, Draugr, Guishin, La Llorona. Both corporeal and incorporeal dead haunt our stories. It is only natural that their homes would share the same sense of foreboding, the same eerie sensation. But those aren't the only things that lurk in the dark. Conan lay in the dark, barely able to move due to the giant chains that bound his arms and legs. His fate was seemingly sealed. Then through the darkness, a woman enters with a key. The jailers are sleeping from drink and drug. She has a key to free him from the chains, but they cannot leave the way she came. The only way out of the dungeon is through it. His new companion provides him with a sturdy knife, just enough for a measure of defense. Together they start slowly making their way through the darkness. She warns Conan. Beyond these dungeons lie the pits which are the doors of hell. Bones lie broken on the dungeon floor. Broken not from torture or malice, but horizontally. Broken for marrow. Conan's mind races. Men break bones for marrow. Does he face cannibals in the dark? The dungeon is ancient, predating the current castle that sits atop them. Decrepit architecture from a dead civilization weakly holding up the foundation of the new. Then he hears it. padded, inhuman feet, a terrifying weight, strength no human could match. A great beast stalked them, smelling his trail in the dark. The creature needed no light to aid its hunt. It pursued the pair, with only faint moonlight piercing through the random crevice. Conan knew he only had one chance. It must be a single, fatal blow, instantly fatal, lest the beast should render him asunder with its titanic strength. Through the darkness, the creature charges. Through the darkness, Conan leaps. They meet in a sanguine embrace. Flesh is split, muscle and sinew, steel and blood. Conan inspired Dungeons & Dragons. The creators have cited the influence of my fellow Texan, Robert E. Howard, had on their imagination. The stories conjure an image of muscle-bound barbarians and evil wizards casting dark magic. It is a sword and sorcery story at its purest. I sat down to read some Conan and picked up a copy of The Hour of the Dragon, the only Conan novel, and the stories held up for me. They are not complex, and there is some casual mild racism and misogyny throughout. Nothing like the extent that you find in Lovecraft, but Howard was a small-town person who never lived in a major city, much less left Texas. Of the towns that he lived in his life, I've only heard of 2 of them, and I've lived in Texas for over 30 years. He was ignorant, having only heard of the ethnic groups he modeled the people of his world with in the books that he read. But that feeling, that type of fantasy, barbarians and warriors who ruled by the sword, evil sorcerers bent on world domination, gritty monsters in the dark, and greedy heroes. This wasn't Tolkien. There are no elves. There's no divine bloodline of rulers. Conan is king because he is the best murderer. It is grimdark before grimdark. This is a world imagined for the dungeon crawl, but it's not the only inspiration for it. A mixed-matched group of travel-weary companions make their way into a grand underground castle. The dwarves had carved themselves a kingdom built on mithril. Wealth beyond imagination lie within the depths, but also danger. Upon entering the mine, they expected a warm welcome. They found only the cold dead.
Moria, you fear to go into those mines. The dwarves delved too greedily and too deep.
Bodies of the slain and butchered lay all around. The rot of corpses, but there was no going back. Like Conan, the only way out was through. So the aged wizard explained their plight.
We now have but one choice. We must face the long dark of Moria. Be on your guard. There are older and fouler things than orcs in the deep places of the world.
A faint light is their only guide. This is a place of doom, filled with vile creatures bent on their destruction and even their consumption. A place of unknown terror, a place where ambition and greed led to destruction and evil. And this was the model when the dungeon expanded outside of the hobby. Dungeons & Dragons' influence on tabletop is easy to see. Like Kleenex, jet skis, or zippers, the brand name has become a term for the whole category. In this case, tabletop role-playing games. But with its ubiquity comes it bleeding into other mediums. Some of the earliest computer games let players delve into the darkest dungeons with ASCII graphics and a virtual D20. These games were birthed quickly. Dungeons & Dragons was released in 1974. By the end of 1975, Petit 5 was released by Ruster Rutherford. It was his attempt to digitize his home Dungeons & Dragons game. Additionally, D&D was released. That's literally D&D, as in 3 letters, all lowercase. Also in 1975, we got a direct line adaptation when the game Moria was released. Or even in 1983, when another dungeon crawler was made called Moria. The object of that game? Enter into the mines of Moria and vanquish the mighty Balrog. This game was the direct influence on one of the greatest dungeon crawlers ever made, Diablo. The first computer role-playing games were, fittingly, trying to recreate the first modern role-playing game. And these games took place in a dungeon. They were dungeon crawlers, the subgenre that birthed the genre of computer role-playing games. In fact, it took arguably 6 years for a computer role-playing game to be released that wasn't set in a dungeon, with Eamon, released in 1980. Now, I grew up in a wizardry household. I remember my father and brothers playing Proving Grounds of the Mad Overlord when I was a kid. I like to think that whenever a fireball is cast in my D&D game, the wizard proclaims, Mahalito, which is especially amazing when you consider that Mahalito means bad breath in Spanish. And the radiating effect doesn't stop with CRPGs. Doom was originally conceived as a representation of id Software's company D&D campaign, and while they changed the fantasy setting to a sci-fi one and swapped the dungeon for the Mars colony, you can still see the residual Dungeons & Dragons in the game. The Cacodemon was just the head of the Astral Dreadnought, taken from the cover of the Manual of the Planes, published by TSR in 1987. Quake had a lot of fantasy DNA incorporated into it, again, as it was also inspired by the company D&D game. Hexen, developed by Raven Software, was also inspired by their company D&D game. The dungeon, and the dungeon crawl, was the genesis for two of the most popular video game genres of all time. Take note, all you Call of Duty players. Grab yourselves a copy of D&D. You'll have fun, and it's good to know your roots. And that's sort of the point. Dungeons seem to have fallen out of favor with a lot of modern gamers, but there's a lot you can do with the concept if you have an understanding of what works well in that context. It's good to know your roots. I know a lot of folks say that you can play any type of game you want in a dungeon. Political intrigue, romance, adventure, all of this can be done in the dungeon. And while I find that to be technically correct, and I'm on the record by stating that technically correct is the best kind of correct, it also ignores why folks use the dungeon and why they're fun to play. I can use Dungeons & Dragons to do a modern tactical shooter if I wanted to, but it doesn't really speak to the strengths of the system. The strength of the dungeon lies with the type of experience you want to get from it. Early Dungeons & Dragons have more in common with modern survival and survival horror games than it does with the fantasy superhero soap opera game. And note, there's nothing wrong with a fantasy superhero soap opera game. I love those games too. Variety is the spice of life, folks. Play different styles of games. But the things that some folks find tedious and throw away in their games are the very things that shine in certain situations and gaming styles. Pathologic is a weird game. Famously described as a pain simulator and the favorite game of fellow YouTuber Aronach, check out their channel, a ton of YouTube videos love to go into the meaning of the game. But one thing I haven't seen folks mention is how it has interesting similarities to old-school dungeon crawl games. Imagine the city in Pathologic is a dungeon. It is populated with odd characters who speak in stilted, unnatural ways. Combat is lethal. You track food. Health isn't easily regained. In Advanced Dungeons & Dragons, what we refer to as 1E or First Edition, even though it's actually the Third Edition, health was recovered by resting at a rate of 1 hit point per day. Per day! And if you had a poor constitution, it would be slower than that. It took a month of rest to ensure that you were back at full health. Things are trying to kill you. Cautious and methodical progression is the key. All the while, there is some esoteric nonsense running on behind the scenes that you may or may not ever see, even if you complete the dungeon. When you get to the conclusion of Bane of the Cosmic Forge, the 6th title in the Wizardry series, which, as a reminder, is a medieval high fantasy dungeon crawler game, there are multiple endings. One, where you get into a spaceship to chase who stole the pen, and head to another planet where literal aliens and other fantasy creatures are all vying to recover it. That is not unprecedented in D&D. As many of you know, the old module written by Gary Gygax, Expedition to the Barrier Peaks, has laser guns, robots, and a spaceship in a medieval fantasy game. The dungeon maps in the adventure are all circles. Because it's a flying saucer, sometimes I think we miss out on the extreme weirdness of this game. There's a lot of Lovecraft in D&D. Mind flayers are very obviously Lovecraftian monsters. Gary Gygax has said so himself. And diving into the ancient ruins of an unknown, possibly evil civilization full of terrifying horrors and the possibility of either death or riches, well, that seems pretty firmly rooted in Lovecraft to me. Medieval Lovecraft, but still Lovecraft. I think the strength of the dungeon is steering into that. It's fed by that type of game. when we get weird, when we get a little scary, when the players are a little confused, a little desperate, and the tension is sky high. That's when I think the dungeon excels. That isn't to say you can't run lighter dungeons, or it won't be fun if you do different things. But I think it's good to know what things are good at and what things are best at. So enjoy your dungeons, be they in your gaming sessions or your bedrooms. I'm not here to judge. And as always, thanks for watching.
Thank you so much everyone for watching the video. If you could please like, comment, and share it around. Subscribe if you like what you saw here. I want to give a special thank you to my executive producers, Caleb Blackie, Critical Cunic, Kim Winson, Les Howie, and Sidekick. Thank you so much. The next video should be coming soon, either later this month or next month. Stay tuned.